In the dungeons of Kirkwall Castle, a mother watched in horror as her 7-year-old daughter's fingers were crushed in iron screws. Her child's screams broke her resolve, forcing a confession she knew was a lie, a confession that sealed her death at the stake. On Scotland's remote Orkney Islands, the line between law and superstition was drawn in blood and fire. For those accused of witchcraft, justice was a terrifying spectacle. But what happens when the only way to stop your family from being tortured is to confess to a crime you didn't commit? This is the story of how a mother's love was turned into a weapon and how a false confession became a death sentence. The Orkney Islands are a place out of time. It's an archipelago of some 70 islands scattered off the northeastern tip of Scotland, where the Atlantic collides with the North Sea. For thousands of years, these windswept landscapes have been steeped in mystery, home to Neolithic tombs that are older than the pyramids and sagas of Norse gods. The very air here feels ancient, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, this deep sense of the unseen curdled into a palpable fear. The old ways, the folk remedies and whispered charms that had been part of life for generations, started to look like something new and terrifying. Across Scotland, a storm of religious and political change was brewing. The Protestant Reformation brought with it a fervent, often fanatical, desire to purge society of anything considered ungodly. In 1563, the Scottish Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act. This short, terrifyingly simple law made practicing witchcraft, or even just consulting with a witch, a crime punishable by death. It didn't bother to define what a witch was, leaving that to the wild imaginations of accusers and the zeal of prosecutors. This new law was supercharged by the beliefs of one man, King James VI of Scotland. After a dangerous sea voyage from Denmark with his new bride, their fleet was battered by violent storms. James was utterly convinced this wasn't natural. He believed it was the work of witches, acting with the devil to destroy him. This royal paranoia ignited one of the most brutal periods of persecution in Scottish history, the North Berwick witch trials, and led James to write his infamous guide to witch hunting, the Demonology. While the great hunts raged on the mainland, a unique and cruel version of this terror was taking root in Orkney. Scottish law was a new thing here. The islands had been culturally and legally Norse for centuries, only coming under Scottish rule in 1468. This created a volatile legal gray area where justice could be easily twisted. And into this power vacuum stepped one of the most tyrannical figures in Orkney's history, a man whose personal greed would pour gasoline on the fire of local superstition. His name was Patrick Stewart, the second Earl of Orkney. Most people just called him Black Patie. Patrick Stewart, or Black Patie, ruled Orkney less like a nobleman and more like a despot. He took over the earldom in 1594 and quickly built a reputation for extravagance, ruthlessness, and a deep-seated paranoia. His feuds were legendary, especially the toxic one he had with his own brothers, who he was convinced were constantly plotting to kill him. Black Patie saw the Witchcraft Act not as a tool for justice, but as a weapon for personal profit. The law had a very convenient clause for a man like him, the property of a convicted which could be forfeited. Patie wielded this clause like a scalpel. Any landowner who got in his way, any family whose farm he wanted, could suddenly face an accusation of witchcraft. He didn't need a commission from the king. In Orkney, his word was law. Under his rule, the islands became a tinderbox of fear. A simple argument between neighbors, a failed crop, a sick cow, anything could be twisted into evidence of dark magic. Testimonies dredged up slights and misfortunes from decades past. People lived in constant terror that a bitter word or a strange look could land them in a torture chamber. Patie wasn't just a participant in the witch hunts. He was an architect of them, exploiting the fear of his people for his own power and profit. It was in this climate, controlled by a tyrant, that an ordinary healer named Allison Balfour was about to be caught in a web of unimaginable cruelty. Allison Balfour lived in Stenness, an area on the Orkney mainland famous for its ancient standing stones. In her community, she was known as a healer, a woman who understood herbs and traditional remedies. In any other time, she would have been a respected figure. But in 1594, under the shadow of Black Patie, her knowledge was a dangerous liability. The Earl's paranoia was laser-focused on his younger brother, John Stuart. Patie was certain John was trying to poison him. His men soon captured one of John's servants, Thomas Papley, who was allegedly found carrying poison. Papley was tortured for 11 days straight until he broke and confessed to a conspiracy. And in that confession, desperate to make the pain stop, he named names. One of them was Allison Balfour. He claimed John Stuart had asked her to help bewitch the Earl. It didn't matter that there was no real evidence. The accusation was all Black Patie needed. Just before his own execution, Thomas Papley recanted everything, stating his confession was forced out of him by torture. But it was too late. The gears of Patie's corrupt justice were already grinding. Allison Balfour, her elderly husband, her son, and her 7-year-old daughter were arrested and dragged to Kirkwall Castle. The man assigned to get her confession was Henry Colville, a local minister and one of the Earl's loyal cronies. For 48 hours, Colville subjected Allison and her family to some of the most barbaric tortures imaginable. His goal wasn't the truth. It was a confession that would cement Patie's case against his brother. What happened next was a nightmare from which there was no waking up. For 2 full days and nights, the dungeons of Kirkwall Castle echoed with screams. According to historical accounts, Allison Balfour showed incredible resilience. She withstood her own torture, insisting she was innocent. But her tormentors knew her breaking point wasn't her own flesh and blood, it was her family's. They brought in her husband, an old man named Taillefer, and put his leg in a device known as the Caspi claws, or iron boots. It was a metal frame that encased the leg. With Allison forced to watch, they took a large hammer and struck the device again and again, crushing bone and flesh. They hit it 57 times. Still, Allison Balfour refused to confess. Next, they brought in her son and did the same to him. Still, she held on. Finally, seeing her spirit wouldn't break, Henry Colville turned to her 7-year-old daughter. He took the child's small hands and locked them into a device called the pennywinkles, a kind of thumbscrew made to crush fingers. As he tightened it, mutilating the little girl's hands right in front of her mother, Colville made Allison a promise. He swore that if she confessed, her life would be spared. The sight of her daughter's agony was the one thing Allison Balfour couldn't bear. Her will shattered. She gave in. She gave Henry Colville the confession he wanted, implicating herself in the plot against Black Patie. She confessed to save her child, trusting a minister's promise that her own life was safe. It was a trust that would be fatally betrayed. With a forced confession secured, the official process of justice could begin. In Kirkwall, the capital of Orkney, an accused witch's journey took them through the city's most sacred and feared locations. Many were first brought to the magnificent St. Magnus Cathedral, but not to pray. Carved into one of the cathedral's thick stone piers was a grim, cell-like dungeon known as Marwick's Hole. It was a dark, bottlenecked pit where the accused were held, often breaking their spirit with psychological torment before the physical torture even began. The trials themselves were often held right inside the cathedral, where a jury of local men would seal their fate based on evidence born of torture and greed. For those found guilty, like Allison Balfour, a final, horrifying procession awaited. The sentence was almost always the same: to be strangled at the stake and then burned to ashes. The execution ground was a place called Gallow Ha, or Gallows Hill, overlooking Kirkwall. The condemned were paraded through the town on a walk of shame, likely down the longest route, to maximize their public humiliation. This was part of the punishment, the complete destruction of a person's reputation before the destruction of their body. On December 16, 1594, Allison Balfour was led up that hill to face her end. Before the sentence was carried out, she was given one last chance to speak. The minister's promise of life was now revealed for the lie it always was. With nothing left to lose, Allison used her final breaths to reclaim her truth. She publicly retracted her entire confession, proclaiming her innocence and describing, for all to hear, the horrific tortures inflicted on her, her husband, her son, and her little girl. Then, the executioner stepped forward, the rope tightened, and her voice was silenced forever. Allison Balfour's fate was sealed by a forced confession. But for others, guilt was determined by ordeals based on a logic so twisted it defied reason. The architects of the witch hunts developed a whole pseudoscience for identifying the devil's servants. One of the most insidious methods was the search for the devil's mark. It was believed that when a witch made their pact with Satan, he'd leave a mark on their body, a spot that was immune to pain. This gave rise to the terrifying profession of the witch pricker. These men were hired to strip an accused person and systematically poke their entire body with sharp pins, looking for any blemish that didn't bleed or hurt. In a state of shock, it was almost inevitable that a victim would eventually fail to react to a prick, and that was all the evidence needed. And then there was the ordeal by water, the so-called swimming test. This is where the grim folklore of witches being drowned comes from. The theory was that holy water, the water of baptism, would physically reject a servant of the devil. An accused person would be bound and thrown into a loch or the sea. If they sank, they were innocent, though they often died in the process of proving it. If they floated, they were guilty. They'd be pulled out of the water only to be executed. But while this ordeal is infamous, there's little historical evidence it was common practice in Orkney. Here, the reality was usually much more direct. For the approximately 70 people accused of witchcraft in Orkney, their destruction came not from a swimming test, but from the agony of torture devices, the humiliation of the pricker's needle, or a confession extracted through the torment of a child. For nearly all of them, the outcome was the same: a lonely death by strangulation and fire on Gallow Ha. This dark chapter of history is a chilling reminder of how easily fear, greed, and power can corrupt justice. The stories of the accused, like Allison Balfour, have been silenced for centuries. If you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe for more dark history and hit the like button to help share this forgotten past with others. The Great Witch craze in Orkney didn't end with Black Patie. In fact, he finally overreached. His endless cruelty and corruption eventually led to his downfall for treason and rebellion against the crown, and he was executed in 1615, a violent end he'd given to so many others. After he was gone, the witch hunts in Orkney actually intensified, with the peak of the panic occurring between 1615 and 1645. Across Scotland, skepticism slowly began to grow. The methods of witch prickers were exposed as fraudulent, and the intellectual fever that fueled the hunts started to fade. Finally, in 1736, the British Parliament repealed the Old Witchcraft Act, making the legal persecution of witches impossible. For nearly 300 years, the victims of the Orkney witch trials lay in unmarked graves, their stories surviving only in dusty court records. Gallow Ha, the site of so much suffering, became just a quiet, green hill overlooking Kirkwall. But recently, a movement began to give these victims the recognition they were denied in death. In 2019, thanks to the work of the Orkney Heritage Society, a memorial was unveiled at Gallow Ha. It's a simple, elegant stone set into the ground. There's no grand statue. Instead, it bears a simple inscription, written not in formal English, but in the soft dialect of the Orkney Islands, a phrase that translates to "they were just folk." They were just folk. Those 4 words are a quiet rebellion. They declare that these victims were not monsters or consorts of the devil. They were folk. They were healers, mothers, neighbors, and daughters. They were people like Allison Balfour, caught in a perfect storm of political ambition, religious fanaticism, and social panic. They were ordinary people, destroyed by an extraordinary fear. The memorial on that quiet hill is not just a reminder of a dark past. It's a testament to their stolen humanity and a solemn promise, written in stone, to never forget that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in stories, but the ones we create ourselves. If you thought a mother's forced confession under torture was horrifying, wait until you hear about the epidemic that turned music into a death sentence. An entire city cursed to dance itself into the grave. Click above to witness the haunting true story of the dancing plague of 1518.